Everyone knows the story, or at least we think we do. World War I, the war to end all wars, came to a close on November 11, 1918, with the signing of the Armistice of Compiègne. The image is iconic: world leaders gathered, generals in their crisp uniforms, the clock striking the 11th hour, and the promise that the guns would fall silent. That's the history we've been told. But what if I told you that the real reason World War I ended wasn't diplomacy, wasn't politics, and wasn't even the battlefield victories? What if it was something far more silent and far more deadly, something that killed more soldiers than bullets, more civilians than bombs, and didn't stop at national borders? The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 didn't just sweep across the world. It may have been the real force that ended the war. To understand why, we have to rewind to the final year of the Great War. By 1918, both the Allied and Central Powers were exhausted. Years of trench warfare had drained armies, resources, and morale. Millions were dead, civilians were starving, governments were financially collapsing, but the war still raged on, until an invisible enemy began to strike. The first wave of the Spanish flu appeared in the spring of 1918, mild enough that it barely made headlines. But by the fall, the virus had mutated into something monstrous. It was unlike any flu the world had ever seen, striking healthy young adults in their prime, often killing within days. In military camps, soldiers reported going to bed feeling fine and being dead by morning. Now imagine that in the middle of a world war. Troop ships became floating incubators, trenches became breeding grounds, and close-quarter living conditions meant that once the flu entered a unit, it could wipe out entire regiments within weeks. It's estimated that in some units up to half the soldiers were too sick to fight. Think about that. Not wounded in combat, but bedridden from a virus. It wasn't just the front lines. Civilians in major cities were dying in numbers that overwhelmed hospitals and morgues. Essential industries were paralyzed. Supply lines broke down. Food shortages worsened. The machinery of war simply could not run without healthy bodies to operate it. The numbers are staggering. While World War I claimed an estimated 17 million lives, the Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, about 5% of the entire global population at the time. That's more than 3 times the war's death toll. In many countries, the pandemic hit during the war's final offensives, creating chaos for military planners. The German Spring Offensive of 1918, a last desperate push to win before American forces fully arrived, was severely undermined as flu tore through German ranks. On the Allied side, the virus ripped through troop convoys crossing the Atlantic. The idea of fresh, strong reinforcements arriving at the front became a dangerous gamble, because new arrivals could bring the disease with them. So, leaders on both sides began to realize that, well, continuing the war meant fighting on 2 fronts, one against the enemy and one against an unstoppable virus. In some accounts, decision-makers actually feared that the pandemic could tip the scales toward total societal collapse if the conflict dragged on any longer. Military historians have noted that by late 1918, flu deaths among soldiers sometimes outnumbered battlefield casualties. There are even reports that some war councils, acknowledged privately that the pandemic's devastation made sustaining combat operations nearly impossible. While the armistice was negotiated for political and strategic reasons, the flu's impact was a shadow force pushing both sides toward the table. It's important to remember that communication about the flu during the war was heavily censored. Countries didn't want to reveal weakness to the enemy, so they downplayed reports of illness. Spain, which was neutral, had a free press that reported openly on the outbreak, which is why the pandemic became known as the Spanish flu, even though it didn't originate there. The secrecy only adds to the mystery of how much the pandemic truly influenced the war's abrupt conclusion. So, did the Spanish flu end World War I? Officially, no. The war ended with signatures on paper, political agreements, and shifting alliances. But if you look deeper, the evidence suggests the pandemic was a decisive, if silent, factor. It crippled armies, devastated home fronts, and forced leaders to consider the cost of continuing. The armistice may have been the final act, but the Spanish flu was the unseen hand pulling the curtain closed. And here's the strangest part. Even though the pandemic was one of the deadliest events in human history, it has been overshadowed in public memory by the war itself. Perhaps that's because the flu didn't fit the heroic narrative of victory. It wasn't a battle won by generals or soldiers. It was a tragedy that no one could claim as a triumph. But history is full of moments where the truth is hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The story of the Spanish flu and World War I is a reminder that sometimes the biggest forces shaping history aren't the ones we can see. They're the ones that spread quietly, invisibly, changing the course of events before anyone even realizes it. And maybe that's the real lesson. History is never just what's written in the textbooks. Sometimes it's stranger and deadlier than we could ever imagine.